Formula One deals with a lot of money and a lot of powerful people. It's no surprise then that there are tons of scandals in the sport. How did an employee at a photocopy shop lead to the biggest scandal in F1 history? And which sex scandal involving a former Bond girl brought down one of the most powerful people in F1? Stay tuned as we count down the biggest scandals in F1 history. First up, Crashgate. Being the son of a legendary racing driver would surely have its perks. You get to access resources and everyone knows who you are. But if you're also a racing driver, it can be a massive amount of pressure to perform. That's what Nelson Piquet Jr. found out in 2008 when he joined the Renault Formula One team. His father, Nelson Piquet, is a three-time world champion and considered to be one of the greatest of all time. So you can imagine the pressure that Piquet Jr. felt, and it didn't help his results. In the first 4 races, he had to retire the car in 2 after colliding with other drivers. He then crashed again in Monaco and spun off the track in Britain. After the midpoint of the season, it was clear that he wasn't at the same level as his teammate Fernando Alonso. His best finish was 7th place. Piquet Jr. was seriously at risk of being cut from the team, and he had to do something to turn it around fast. Then came the Singapore Grand Prix. It's a tricky street circuit where there are many accidents, so it was not a big surprise when Piquet spun out of a corner and crashed into a wall. He said that the crash was a simple mistake, but less than a year later, reports started to emerge that Piquet Jr. was ordered to crash by the Renault team to give Fernando Alonso an advantage. Alonso had just pitted, and a safety car would give him a big advantage when other teams were not allowed to pit. An FIA investigation concluded that the team had indeed ordered Piquet Jr. to crash, and as a result, Renault was disqualified from Formula One and banned for 2 years. In addition, Flavio Briatore, the team's manager, was banned from ever managing a Formula One team again. But others involved in the conspiracy, like Pat Simmons, continued to have prominent roles in Formula One. But poor old Nelson Piquet Jr. left the next season and never returned to F1. Next up, Monaco. Michael Schumacher was a genius driver. He always knew exactly how to get past his rivals and keep them behind him, but some of his tactics have been very questionable. One time that he was caught out for some sneaky tactics was at the 2006 Monaco Grand Prix. As predicted, Schumacher was the fastest during qualifying. He was a master at Monaco and always looked totally in control. He had already set a blistering fast lap time and was putting in one more before the session ended. He turned the final corner, known as Rascasse, but was slow to turn his wheels and ended up having to stop before he hit the wall. His lap was ruined, and for a moment it looked like the 7-time world champion had made a rookie error. But then the yellow flags came out and all the drivers behind him were forced to slow down and abandon their qualifying laps. That meant that Schumacher's time was the fastest and it couldn't be contested. He would be in pole position for the start. Schumacher defended himself and said he was just doing a touch too much, but the stewards were not convinced, and after an investigation, penalized him by sending him to the back of the grid. Years later in 2014, Nico Rosberg pulled a similar move at a different part of the circuit. He had the fastest lap and Lewis Hamilton was speeding behind him, trying to beat him. When Rosberg conveniently couldn't make a turn, he was forced down an escape road and brought out the yellow flags. He must have learned that from Michael, but this time Nico didn't get penalized at all. How did a photocopy lead to the biggest scandal in Formula One history? And what sex scandal brought down the president of the FIA? Don't go anywhere to find out. Now we have the 2005 US Grand Prix. This May, Formula One goes to Miami for the first time. It's a big move into the United States market, and it shows that there's growing interest in the sport. But Americans have had a difficult relationship with F1 in the past. Between 2007 and 2012, there was no US Grand Prix on the calendar. That was because of the disaster that happened in 2005. Before 2010, teams could usually pick which tire brand they wanted to use for each season. This gave teams more options, but it also caused some problems. The first problem came up during practice when Ralf Schumacher was in a bad crash after one of his tires failed, but the driver that replaced him had exactly the same problem as Schumacher did, and his tire failed too. The two drivers were part of the Toyota team and were using Michelin tires. They were one of 7 teams that had their tires supplied by Michelin, which included McLaren and Renault, and the rest of the teams had their tires supplied by Bridgestone. Michelin couldn't figure out what the issue was and asked the FIA to put in a chicane to slow the cars down at turn 13, which was the area causing the most issues with the tires. The teams proposed a number of different solutions, which were all rejected by the FIA, and so after the formation lap, all the Michelin tire cars returned to the pit lane because it wouldn't be safe to start the race. This totally confused anyone watching the race. It was an unprecedented occasion when only 6 cars lined up to the grid to start. Michael Schumacher won the race, and it was probably the easiest win of his entire career. Up next, Max Mosley. Sex, a Bond girl, and Nazis. No, this isn't the plot of a movie. It was a scandal involving one of the highest-ranking people in Formula One. This one is a bit raunchy, so you might want to cover the kids' ears. In 2008, the president of the FIA, Max Max Mosley was involved in a scandal when a newspaper got hold of a very private video of his. In a video that was released publicly by the newspaper News of the World, Mosley was seen engaging in sexual activity with 5 other women. One of the girls that he hired was even a Bond girl. That was a little scandalous, but that wasn't the real news. The real news was that according to the website, they were doing some kind of Nazi-themed role-playing. It was described as a sick Nazi orgy. What made it even worse for Max was that his father was Sir Oswald Mosley, who was the leader of the British Union of Fascists. His son had tried to distance himself from this, but the scandal didn't help a whole lot. When his father got married in 1933, it was at the home of Joseph Goebbels, and Adolf Hitler was their guest of honor. Max Mosley sued the newspaper that released the video and ended up winning, and he also won a court case against Google to censor images from the video. But it was too late. His reputation was forever destroyed, and he retired from the FIA a year later. Then we have Spygate. If you thought all engineers did was equations and designs, you'd be wrong. This next one was the biggest scandal that Formula One has ever seen. It was a normal afternoon in a photocopy shop near Woking, and a lady came into the shop with a big order. She had 780 pages that she needed to be copied right away. The employee got to work, but noticed something unusual about the documents the lady had. They seemed to be marked confidential and belonged to the Ferrari Formula One team. This seemed a little suspicious, and so the worker got in contact with Ferrari after finishing the job. It turns out that the woman was Trudy Coughlin, the wife of Mike Coughlin, who was the chief designer of the McLaren Formula One team. Something fishy was going on, and so Ferrari investigated. Sure enough, they discovered that an employee of theirs had been sharing information with the enemy. Ferrari's head of performance development, Nigel Stepney, was then accused of sharing technical information with a McLaren employee named Mike Coughlin. The FIA found McLaren guilty of possessing illegal information about another team's technical design, and they were fined a record $100 million. That is still the biggest fine in sporting history. On top of that, they were disqualified from competing in the Constructors' Championship for that year. But Hamilton and Alonso, the 2 drivers, were allowed to compete in the Drivers' Championship because they were offered immunity in exchange for their full cooperation. Then, in the same year, the Renault F1 team was also found to be in possession of confidential McLaren information, so everyone was spying on everyone. It sounds more like James Bond than motorsport. Which scandal was the most shocking on the list? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.